we all stand, I'd like for us to have about a 10-second silence in honor of Alec Anderson.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I'm going to Kevin, our speaker today. I've known him all his life. He was born and raised here in Kingsport. So I just want to say a few words about him. And I've got to say this first. Alex was the finest man I've ever met in my life. And I've lived for 87 years. And he was the finest man I've ever known. Thank you. Kevin's graduated of Dobbins High School. And he worked at WKPT in his radio days. Then he worked at Knoxville. Then he worked at Columbus, Ohio. And on the last, he was in Chattanooga for several years. So he can tell you more than I do. I just want you to know what I want to hear from Kevin this morning.
That's good enough. Thank you, Mr. Jack. I appreciate it. Yeah, I was going to say that's enough, right? There's not much more I can say to that. But I also want to say, while I set this up here, while I set up the program, and it's funny. About a year ago, I got a call from Jack Pierce. He says, there's this guy from the Kingsport Historical Society. He's very anxious to talk to you, and he's been trying to get a hold of you. So it says, I gave him your number, and he's going to call you. Well, about that time, even before I got that call, I got an email from Alex Anderson. He told me he was the president of the Kingsport Historical Society. Well, of course, my eyes lit up. You know, I was ready for that. He said he knew my daddy when my daddy owned Sneed's cleaning service here in town. And he knew my grandfather, Horace Sneed, out at Eastman, because my grandfather was general foreman out there, along with Jack. And he said that the commission wanted me, or actually, the society wanted to commission me to research and write the official history of African Americans in Kingsport to go along with the city's 100th anniversary. And to have that history recorded along with the history of Kingsport. You know, that's a pretty big honor, actually. It's a pretty big honor. And he said that he'd heard that I was the expert on local African American history. Well, I do know a lot about that. I put together the history website for the Douglas High School over here in Riverview. I was raised in the neighborhood, as Mr. Jack said. I've seen and heard a lot of things, you know, about people and events in the community. Because I was about to retire from 48 years of working as a television newscaster, retirement took up most of my time. And so I didn't get to really start researching the history until back last summer. And even then, it took about 5 months to gather all of the information, gather all of the facts, all of the data that I'd collected, stuff I'd heard all my life, you know, growing up. All that stuff had to be cataloged and confirmed through any of the records. And that took a lot of time. In fact, it took 6 months. It was 6 months of working back and forth, coming to Kingsport, going to the library, talking to people who are deceased now, no longer with us. And so I started putting everything together back in the fall, and by December, I had finished it. Of course, that was the end of the Kingsport Centennial celebration. But that didn't matter to Alex. That did not matter to him. And this is what I loved about him. He said, I still want this. We've got to have this. This is part of Kingsport's history. It is Kingsport's history. It's not just the history of African Americans in Kingsport. It's the history of Kingsport. And so we've got to look at it that way. Even though I don't live here now, people still think I do. Riverview has been part of my life for 57 of my 63 years. And from right here where I'm standing, we all know where Riverview is, right? It's about 10, 12 blocks that way. 50 years ago and beyond that, that wasn't the only African American community in Kingsport. African Americans have always been here. Back in the early 1900s, they worked right alongside white people. They were there helping when Eastman got started back in the day. This is a picture of the Pierce brothers, Jack Pierce's father and his father's brothers. They were hauling lumber from Horse Creek, where they lived, to Tennessee Eastman to use back in 1917 in the wood distillation process there. Most African Americans back then, they lived in either the Rotherwood Heights area and West Kingsport and west of Netherland End. As the jobs grew, the growing industries found workers in the black community eager and ready to do many of the jobs that the white workers did not want to do. Those black workers began moving closer and closer and closer to the center of town. Now in this picture, which is from Wings over Kingsport in 1938, those workers wanted to be closer to Eastman, the cement plant, the brickyard, the Kingsport foundry, Borden Mills, Mead, the Kingsport Press, because that's where they worked, and usually they had to walk to get there. So they wanted to live closer to these industries that you see in this picture here. But now remember, Kingsport, like a lot of other cities around the country, they were in the throes of segregation. With that idiocracy, the city's thinking, well, where are we going to put black people? Where do we put them? We got to put them somewhere. The sad fact was, during segregation, African Americans could not call the shots. And ultimately, and unfortunately, they couldn't just live anywhere. Well, a lot of African American people had settled in the Dale Street, Maple Street, Oak Street, Walnut Street, it's Sevier Avenue now, and the East Sullivan Street area that you see here. The bottom business down at the bottom, that's Kingsport Foundry. That's Sullivan Street running this way, longwise. And then this one street over here is Oak Street, going up the Oak Street Hill. African Americans in their new homes immediately contacted their brothers, their uncles, their cousins, their relatives. They told them, hey, look, you need to come to Kingsport. You need to move to Kingsport. There are jobs here. There's a lot of money here. You need to move here and bring the young'uns with you and the family. And there was one family obligation. When you move here, you don't have a place to stay, you can stay with us until you find a place to live. Well, you can imagine what that was like. This is the result of that. Shacks, garages converted into living quarters, ramshackle homes made out of wood and cardboard that the records show were still owned by white people in the area, but who were looking to make a little money off the wave of black people moving in. I've talked to some of the older African Americans in the community, and they remember their brothers and their cousins hauling cardboard and wood home from the dumpsters downtown to fix the walls of their homes that were caving in. In the late 1930s, leaders in the African American community demanded the city of Kingsport find them a bigger place to live. Now remember, we're still in a segregated society. You know, the city wasn't just going to put a community of black people here on Linville Street, Watauga Street, Catawba Street, you know, the downtown area. There was no way they were going to do that. So for context, and knowing that, let's go back to this 1938 picture of industrial Kingsport. Black people had already been looking at the Gibson Mill area over behind the hospital, that little area down there where the mill was. They'd already been looking at that. They also looked in the Fort Robinson area, which was near the original place that was close to Rotherwood and Rotherwood Heights. They thought that would be closer. But all of a sudden, people started noticing a lot of activity in that circle up there, that red circle up there. That was across Sullivan Street and the railroad tracks. There was a lot of bulldozers, a lot of dump trucks moving around in there. They were hauling in dirt, moving stuff out, putting down rock, putting down dirt on top of that, then smoothing everything out, putting down more rock, more fill dirt, smoothing that out. If you know a lot about the beginnings of Kingsport and that particular area right there, that circle there, that area was where the old Federal Dye Stuff and Chemical Company used to be. That's the business that was the predecessor to Eastman. That was there before Eastman was. When that company went out of business, they just walked away, left all of their equipment on the ground, their chemical tanks, everything. Everything they had stored there, they just walked. When they went bankrupt, they couldn't haul it out. So they just left it. There was no EPA, no environmental people, to say, oh, look, you've got to move all that stuff out. You got to mitigate this area. You got to clean the ground up. So they left all of their stuff there. Well, that place right there turned into the dumping ground for every industry in Kingsport. And this is the research. I found this out by going through the library records and also listening to people that I grew up with talk about it. And I confirmed it and went back and found where they'd done that. Eastman used to bring all of their stuff and dump it right there. Mead, they bring all of the chemicals from the the press, all of the chemicals from the paper making and the book making process that they couldn't get rid of. They would take it and dump it where the Federal Dye Stuff and Chemical Company used to be. And they just left it there. All of their industrial, their broken down tractors, all of the stuff that wouldn't work anymore, they dumped it right there. Now this is what it looked like back in 1938. It was a flat area anyway. And then after a while, when they stopped dumping there, the grass and the weeds just took it all over. Now right around that same time as African Americans were looking for a place that the city would let them expand to, Kingsport just kind of snuck in there in the middle of the night, and they bought in those dump trucks like I was talking about, and they smoothed that area over and they put all that fill dirt down there. They carved the land and divided the land into lots and then offered that to black folks for what I'm told, I believe it was like $50 an acre, something like that, $50 an acre. Folks, back then that was a steal. $50 an acre? $50, we all know it went a long way back then. But $50 an acre and it's yours and you can build a house on it. The research that I did showed that might have been the cheapest land anywhere in the city of Kingsport back then. If you go back and you look at all the records down at City Hall. Now the Kingsport Housing Authority had already had an option on 1/3 of this land up here. And that's where they were going to put public housing units. And that's this housing right here. This housing right here. All of that was going to become the Riverview Apartments. And they went in there and they built those first. And then the homes, the individual homes for people, started springing up on all the streets around it. Well, of course, anybody would jump at a deal like that, $50 an acre. They're going to jump at that because you can build a house, get your family in there. You're inside the city, so, supposedly you have city services, things like that. Mrs. Bessie Hips won a contest to name the new community. She thought about it for a little bit. According to her daughter, she thought about it. She came up with the name Riverview. To this day, nobody knows why she picked the name Riverview. Number one, look at this. Just look at the picture. Tell me where the river is anywhere in this picture. Okay? Riverview. that's assuming you can see the river, right? Wrong. You can't see the river at all. The river's over behind that hill up there. But she called it Riverview. It stuck. The city wrote it down. Okay, you got your $100. Thank you. She won the contest to name the community Riverview, and that's what she picked. Well, you couldn't see the river that much unless it rained real hard. Ms. Lily Smith lived for years on Dunbar Street. She told me how much she hated moving to Riverview back in the late 30s and early 40s, right after it opened up. She said it smelled, the dirt roads kept the yards dirty all the time, it flooded all the time. You could actually see the ground percolating in areas when it rained real hard, when the rain wasn't flooding the streets. Believe it or not, I took this picture here as late as 1968. That's flooding in Riverview because the drainage system caved in. And it just, every time it rained real hard, we had like 4 or 5 streets or 4 or 5 intersections in Riverview that always flooded because the rainwater wouldn't rush away. Now, it didn't rain it didn't rain hard all the time. Even though it did rain and we did have this occasionally, it was still a community. African Americans stayed in Riverview. They raised families there. They paid taxes there. Everybody had nice yards. Riverview actually prospered back in the day. Together with the black community that was still in the Dale, Oak Street, Maple Street area in East Sevier, Riverview actually became a city within a city. Because of segregation, Riverview had its own churches, its own accredited elementary high school, the Douglas School that you see here, named after Frederick Douglass, the statesman and orator. The first Douglas School on East Sevier and Center Street, actually it was East Walnut Street back in those days. It was built with community funds, school board funds, and also money from the Rosenwald Fund that built schools for black kids back in the 1920s and 1930s. Well, the city outgrew that pretty quick, and a new building was built. In fact, it was a modern building that was built inside the new Riverview community. This was the newest school in the Kingsport city school system. Everything in there was new. Talk to Jill Ellis about that. She was there when this school opened up. Everything was new. The desks were new, the books were new, the sports uniforms were new, not the hand-me-downs that they used to get from Dobbins Bennett, where they had to dye them blue and gold, the Douglas school colors. The players would get out on the field. You remember the players would get out on the basketball court or the football field, and they would start sweating, and all those colors would start running. They'd all start running, and they would be just dripping in blue and gold dye.
This one on the right is Jack Pierce. When they were 1947, they were state champions.
Mm-hmm. I'll pass this around too. This is a very historic picture. They actually won the state football championship. Little Douglas High School. These guys, they were just, isn't that something? Just stop and think about that. What does it take to get to a state football championship game? It means you just got to whip the pants off the competition.
Calvin,
and they did.
Bill Ring gave that picture to Jack this morning.
How about that?
Yeah.
How about that? And it's clear. Y'all need to see it. Wait, pass it around. Pass it around. Yeah, take a look at that. Very, very historic picture. And that's another thing. The lab tubes in the science classes, they were new. The new PA system. They have the newest PA system of all of the schools in Kingsport. No other school had a PA system where the principal could stand in the office, talk into the microphone, and he could pick out each individual classroom that he could talk to. Today, Dobbins, they can do that with video. Back then, we only had the audio. But it was the most modern thing that nobody else had. Get this back down there. There we go. Riverview had its own churches. All of them sprang up from this church right here, the Central Baptist Church. This building still stands right now on Carver Street. It's got a new, big, modern addition behind it. And by the way, next month, the Central Baptist Church in Kingsport, Tennessee will celebrate 100 years of spreading the gospel in the African American community. It is the oldest African American church in Kingsport, and it's one of the oldest black churches anywhere in the Tri-Cities. Riverview also had its own business district on Lincoln Street, and man, it was a hopping place. I'm telling you, restaurants, dry cleaners, companies with people that did carpentry and masonry work, plumbers, they built homes, had offices down there. There was a mortuary service. There were meeting halls that used to host musical groups on what was called the Chitlin Circuit. You remember that, Mr. Jack? The Chitlin Circuit, where you had Fats Domino come and play a night, and then move on to Johnson City, and then move on to Morristown, and then move on to Knoxville, and then Nashville. That was called the Chitlin Circuit. Started from up around Washington, D.C., and they called it Chitlin Circuit because they only played black establishments. But they worked their way through the South doing that. The Temptations came here. The Jackson Five, Fats Domino, Otis Redding, the Impressions, the Drifters, the Marvelettes, Jackie Wilson. They all played in this building right here. The old Masonic Hall. It had a auditorium with seating and a stage that raised you up, I think, it raised you up. it raised you up a little bit. Everybody played there. Everybody stopped there. And it became well known as a place to go to really have a good time and listen to some good music. And it was right down there on Lincoln Street. All the restaurants were popular, especially Edge's Place. Got to tell you about Edge's Place. This is a friend of mine, Frida Bristol. She's waiting on Reverend Edge back there, I think he's building her hamburger. His hamburgers were legendary. You like Pals? Everybody likes Pals. Reverend Edge's hamburgers, it's almost, he salt and pepper and some spices, but they tasted like restaurant burgers, like the restaurant burgers that you would get at Woolworths or Cress's or some of the drugstores. I mean, they were just, I can still taste it. To this day, I can still taste his hamburgers. He also sold furniture. He had appliances, clothes, canned goods, packaged food, children's toys. He had radios, record players, a couple of TV sets for store in there. Those things I used to see in his store myself. I saw them with my own eyes. He also had a rooming house upstairs. He had a couple of refrigerators in there once, a washer-dryer combination. He was the poor man's Walmart. He sold absolutely everything in there. And right across the street, that's his red building back there in the back. Right across the street was the Riverview swimming pool. That pool is now the splash pad, which is very popular right now, and not just to folks in Riverview. Reverend Edge pastored at several churches in Kingsport and Bristol, and on the surface, he could be kind of gruff sometimes. He could really, he made a great, I don't know that he had kids, but he was a great parent to all of the kids in Riverview, because you didn't near act up. He was a man of faith, and you don't mess with a man of faith. If you do something wrong, expect to get corrected. Okay? The kids loved him though. He'd show Christian films. He sponsored events to give the kids at Douglas School something to do after the school let out. Just an absolutely wonderful man. Now, the only walk-up restaurant in Riverview was this place called the Dairy Mart. They also called it a confectionery, which I think was just a fancy word for saying, okay, come here and get your ice cream and then go away. It was owned by Norm A. and Jason Taylor. Jason Taylor also owned the Art Dry Cleaners downtown on Main Street. right downtown. The Dairy Mart made history by being the very first place in Kingsport to sell foot-long hot dogs. That was the first place to get foot-long hot dogs. This was back in the 50s. And by the way, Norm May Taylor, she's still alive. She's still with us today. She's in a nursing home. And last month, she turned 100 years old. Now we're getting into kind of a different part of Kingsport's history with African Americans. Desegregation was introduced at a meeting right here in the Douglas School Auditorium in March of 1965 with the announcement that the African American neighborhood school would close for good the next year. With that, the Riverview community would integrate its kids into the white kids in Kingsport. Well, it seemed right for Kingsport because after all, I mean, black adults and white adults have been working alongside each other at Eastman and all these plants all these years, you know, all the factories. So it just seemed like the right thing. I mean, they were doing it elsewhere around the country, you know, so it sounded good to do that in Kingsport. Well, I can tell you that a whole lot of changes were in store for African Americans in Kingsport. Some good things, some not so good things. To compensate for the bad things, the African American community relied on their churches to get by. But that did not stop one big powder keg from exploding. And exploded it did. The frustrations of African American students trying to adjust to their new school relationships resulted in an all-out confrontation at Dobbins Bennett High School on Tuesday, May 29th, 1973. Reportedly over the selection of an all-white cheerleading squad. According to the article in the newspaper, about 30 black and white students were involved in the initial confrontation, but students reported about 300 students in subsequent fighting after the first fights got started. Jill Ellis told me that she was teaching school at DB. We'd already integrated. We'd been integrated about 6 years. And she said she was in the cafeteria trying to stop the fights. She said the plates were flying, the kids were angry, they were throwing trays and food at each other, and there was a whole lot of name calling. And I think you can imagine the one name that got thrown around a lot. I won't repeat it here. Police were called, classes were canceled for the rest of the week, along with class day and awards day. You forget, this is at the end of the year. Some of these kids were about to graduate. Some of the kids that were in the fights were about to graduate. But they called all of that off. Graduation day was postponed and rescheduled. There were several assaults, but there were no arrests. I think cooler heads may have started prevailing that day. The newspaper in this article reported that 5 black students and 2 white students were suspended over the fighting. Now, the newspaper also reported that about 300 African American parents gathered at the old Douglas School Auditorium that night to voice their anger at the way the city handled the situation. One concerned black parent who went to the school that day of the fighting noted that black parents went to DB to help stop trouble, while white parents came to just take their kids away. Jill Ellis told me that tensions had been building up to the confrontation. She said the conditions had reached a boiling point and something had to burst. Something had to give. She says after that pressure was released, things calmed down a little bit and finally a dialogue got started. It was a pretty rough time because in my opinion, and again, it's just my opinion, and I lived through it. I was here. I saw it. They didn't start the fight until a year after I'd already graduated DB. But I could see the powder keg building up since 1966 when I left Douglas and went to John Sevier the first time. Kingsport, in my opinion, did not try to introduce integration to its community. They didn't try to introduce it slowly and deliberately like the bigger cities did. Bigger cities, they had meetings, they got everybody in a room, they introduced each other, they said they got them to be friends. You know, sometimes you had to force them, but ultimately it clicked in bigger cities. It actually worked. Kingsport didn't do that. They just rushed right into it without giving white people or black people a chance to get to know each other. We had a lot of the same interests. We didn't find that out until after we'd knocked heads. Then we found out that we had something in common. They just didn't give people a chance to get used to it. The city did move forward, but you don't know whether it was because of fear, concern, or compassion. And later, to help ease the tension, a black cheerleader was added to the DB cheerleading squad. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, African Americans were finally, at long last, becoming part of Kingsport's political structure. In 1973, Richard Watterson, who graduated Douglas High School, Swift Junior College in Rogersville, and Livingston College in North Carolina, was elected to the City Board of Mayor and Aldermen. He was the first African American to run for and win the vote for an elected office in Kingsport. Huge milestone, huge milestone. Watterson would also serve as vice mayor. He is still with us too. His health is up and down. He and his wife Barbara live in Johnson City, and I see them frequently. Watterson came into office on a human relations platform back in those days, in an effort to make sure the voices of the city's growing African American population were heard. His platform noted that at one point Kingsport only had one black city employee. Over the next few years, at least 8 were hired in various capacities like Parks and Recreation, the School Crossing Guard program. At that time, he said the sole purpose of the hiring appointments is to get the minority race more involved in our city government, which in turn will cause them to feel like they're part of the community by promoting brotherly love for one another. That basically did it. If we'd done that with integration back in the day, if we'd done it this way, we wouldn't have had fights. Another part of Watterson's platform was the appointment, also in 1973, of local black businessman Horace P. Sneed to the Kingsport Planning Commission. At the time, Sneed also graduated Douglas. He also graduated Douglas High School. He was a member of the Chamber of Commerce's Beautification Committee, and he told the Kingsport Times-News at that time in an article that he actually favored annexation. He favored annexation. He said if it's good for the city, it's good for the people that are also being annexed. I'm kind of close to this guy. He's my father. At one point, Kingsport's Board of Zoning Appeals also had an African American board member, Dr. Joseph Walton. You remember Dr. Walton? Joe Walton? Dr. Walton? Well, actually, he was appointed to the board, but he resigned in '73 because he was moving to Johnson City. During the '70s, the social life of African Americans began to flourish. Aside from locations housing the local Elks Club chapter, the Masonic Hall, the American Legion, the Milton Burdine Post, the building, we called it, when I was growing up in Riverview, we called it the Hut. Jack Pierce remembers 2 neighborhood civics clubs that everybody seemed to belong to. And this was one of them, right here. The Merrymakers Club. Extremely popular. It was mostly an older club, but just about everybody belonged to it. Every New Year's, the members had a big party, the women in their flowing gowns and, the perfume, the jewels, the high heels. The men had their tuxedos, their shiny black shoes. It was something else. It really was. It was the social event in Riverview. There was also the Esquire Club that Mr. Pierce belonged to. You told me that they had parties and get-togethers. You said that they were kind of a younger crowd to the Merrymakers Club, but you had just as much fun at your events as the Merrymakers did. He also says the 2 civic groups, they respected each other because where you had grandfathers in this group here, you had their sons in this group here. And he said they were never, ever in competition with each other. Into the 1980s, along with an increase in population. See, we're moving on up now. In the 1980s came a cancer that decimated every single community where it reared its ugly head. The drug problem came in on top of a lack of jobs in Riverview. The cops didn't enforce the laws that much. There really wasn't a lot of activities for young African Americans, for young people. The drug problem on top of that absolutely crippled the community. It tore it apart. One person told me in Riverview's oral histories, the kind man and the wicked man will do things in equal quantity. You can act nice, but when you get them drugs in you, you'll do absolutely anything. And he was absolutely right. This is a drug deal going down at the playground in Riverview. I saw it with my own eyes. I watched stuff going back and forth. I knew exactly what it was. I snapped that picture at the time. I blurred the faces because the people were never charged, and I didn't want to identify them. Drugs, gambling, bootlegging, robberies, assaults, shootings, above all, fear completely engulfed the neighborhood. It was a stain on the community for years. It got so bad, many folks in Riverview would tell you they were afraid to even sit on their front porch in the middle of the day because they were afraid of what was going on, much less walk the streets that they grew up on. And believe it or not, the worst was yet to come. To a person, everybody in Riverview's African American community will say the turning point in the neighborhood happened one warm summer night in late June of 1994. The way the quote was given to me by somebody who saw it, it was just two dudes out in the middle of the field shooting at each other. Caught in the crossfire, this little girl, Jalissa Ferguson. She was only 7 years old. She was sitting on her front porch at the apartments on Lewis Street, like you just saw a few minutes ago, playing with her dolls. The shooting involved two drug dealers, and it happened in the Douglas ball field directly in front of those apartments. Everybody said that they were fighting over turf. Jalissa Ferguson died instantly from a bullet wound to the head. You can only imagine the reaction and the outrage, not only in Riverview, but in all of Kingsport. People just absolutely could not believe that that had happened. All of a sudden, you saw more police. You saw the cops patrolling more. This is a picture from that time. You saw cops walking the street. You'd think somebody had declared martial law in that community. Of course, the drug kingpins and the drug abusers, they ran and hid like the rats that they are whenever somebody shines a light on them. Did all of that attention stop the drug traffic? Well, we all know what cancer does. We've all been touched. Everybody in here, I'm sure, has been touched by cancer. We all know what a cancer does. Radiation and chemotherapy do slow it down, but they never stop it. The drug cancer came back to Riverview with a vengeance that a lot of people said appeared in the form of a Lincoln Street nightclub that started getting all of the headlines. None of them good. Back in 2002, the headlines read, 2002, Lincoln Street rezoned, Club 229 opens. In February that year, fight inside Club 229 ends with Knoxville resident shot outside. The next year, Kingsport police said in a newspaper interview, 41% of the city's drug arrests for the year occurred in Riverview and the surrounding South Central Kingsport community. Many people had moved to Riverview by the turn of the century, by the year 2000, but some of the newcomers were never counted by the Census Bureau. They were people that former Kingsport Police Chief Gail Osborne told me, myself, had no other reason to be in Riverview other than to sell and use illegal drugs. He said the drug trade back then was so organized that when the big fish eat the little fish control the pond. The minute you put one of them in jail, another fish moves right up and takes the business over right after them. During this ride along with Shiloh Baptist Church Pastor Kenneth Calvert and the police chief, Reverend Calvert said from the old 229 Club down Lincoln Street to Dunbar Street, It was nothing to have drug dealers stop in front of your car and ask you if you wanted to buy drugs. Even sitting right beside the chief of police in an unmarked car, in plain clothes, they would still walk up to you and try to sell you drugs. Did they know that was the police chief that was sitting on the other side of Reverend Calvert? Did they know that? They probably did. But they were brave enough to do it right there in front of the police chief. Let's go back to the 229 Club. In May of 2006, Club 229 was declared a public nuisance by the Sullivan County Chancery Court for stuff just like this. Watch that guy walking around. Police say they had 33 complaints over a 3-year period. They included 2 reports of shots fired, 5 reports of shootings at the 229 Club, 1 rape, 7 assaults, 7 disturbances, and 3 reports of disorderly conduct. And I think I mentioned there were several reports of shots being fired. One of those was this one. Watch the guy to the right of the screen. That's the Club 229 Club. The video you just saw was surveillance video shot by the Kingsport Police Department as they were building a case to take this to Chancery Court to shut him down. And all of this in the Riverview community. Can you imagine sitting on your front porch? You can see the 229 Club across the ball field from your front porch. You're hearing this constantly, hearing it all the time. I mean, after a while you get so used to it that unless it's really loud, you don't think it's close to you. But you do hear it around the corner. You do hear it down the street. You hear it back this way. You go to your car to go to the grocery store to buy food for your family. You hear shots, just like you just heard. This was a common occurrence in Riverview at this point. Luckily, once again, the winds of change blew in Riverview's direction with the closing of the 229 Club. Folks said when they took the sign down, the reclaiming of the community started. That one single action, when the sign came down, is what did it. The people who wanted change had heard of something called Weed and Seed. It's a program that takes federal money from the U.S. Department of Justice to weed out the drug dealers and the crime in a neighborhood and then plant the seeds of rebirth, growth, and prosperity. That program worked in bigger cities. Why not Kingsport? The answer to that question was the Catch the Vision organization proposed by the Kingsport Tomorrow organization. That later became South Central Kingsport Community Development Corporation. The goal was to promote human, economic, and community development in conjunction with the Weed and Seed program. Of everything it promised, it would lead to a better quality of life in South Central Kingsport. You're not going to believe this, We still have that organization today, South Central Kingsport Community Development Corporation. You're not going to believe this, where it's headquartered, along with several other community service organizations. Guess where the offices are? The one place you'd never guess. The old 229 Club Building. Now, how's that for in your face to the drug dealers? We want our neighborhood back. We want it back. It was decided that the strength of reclaiming the community had to start with the children. It had to start with the kids. You know, these young minds. We were all used to it. We all knew. People our age, it's difficult to teach an old dog new tricks. But the kids, those young minds, those are the ones that you can reach. And they figured, you know, if you reach the kids first, their parents and the rest of the neighborhood, they're going to fall right in behind them. As a result, Johnny May Swaggerty and the late local entertainer Tim Hall started up a program called the New Vision Youth. It was a refuge for parents who wanted their kids to have more positive influences in the Riverview community. They do drug awareness drills, outreach programs. They take trips to historic sites. They do cleanup and litter programs like the one you see here. They do this twice a year. They do anti-smoking campaigns. They take trips to historic sites. They even take part in the operation of government. Over the years, the kids have had an active role in the workings of Kingsport City government by simply leading the Pledge of Allegiance at the Kingsport Board of Mayor and Alderman meetings. Richard Watterson said, stop and think about that, because that's a blessing in disguise. It might even produce some new city leaders in the group. And speaking of that, speaking of city government, I got to mention Nathan Vaughn in the history of African Americans in Kingsport. He was the first African American from Kingsport ever elected to state government. Specifically, Tennessee State Representative from the 2nd District of Sullivan County. That includes Sullivan Gardens, Colonial Heights, and most of Kingsport. When you go back and you look at everything where Riverview has been and African Americans have been in Kingsport up to now, it took a whole lot of community activism, a lot of complaints, even a death. But eventually the drug problem got under control. Riverview residents started calling the cops whenever they saw something bad going on, much to their detriment, even jumping up in the faces of some of the drug dealers and the prostitutes. They just decided they weren't going to take it anymore. High-powered surveillance cameras in the neighborhood also gave them confidence and assurance. If you've ever been to Riverview and you've gone down ML King, you'll see a cell tower on the other side of the railroad tracks over off Main Street. Well, it's a cell tower. It is a cell tower. It's also got a high-powered HD camera that has a zoom radius on it that is like 1,000,000 to 1. The police can sit down here in the dispatch center down here, and I know because I was there. I was there when they took this picture, and he said, I want to show you how this works. He started that camera from way off where you could see all of the neighborhood, and then he zoomed it in all the way, kept going, kept going, kept going, I know, kept going, past cars, past trees. He zoomed in on a cigarette butt down here on the ground. Guess what? It was a Marlboro cigarette. You know how I know? Because I read it. I could see it. I could see it from that camera. Well, that woke us up, didn't it? I mean, it was that camera was that powerful. Having cameras like that in the neighborhood gave a lot of the residents who'd been complaining for so long about the crime, gave them a whole lot of confidence, security, and assurance. More urban renewal came in 2006 when KHRA got a Hope 6 neighborhood revitalization grant worth about $12 million. They used it to tear down their aging Riverview apartments and replace them with new mixed-income affordable homes. Now, most of the money was used to upgrade and restore the V.O. Dobbins Community Center across the street, and within that, the soul of the Douglas High School. It's been called the crown jewel of Kingsport, and it's located in the heart of Riverview. In September of 2010, the renovated V.O. Dobbins Senior Community Center and Complex opened up. It's got 2 gymnasiums, renovated Head Start classrooms, it's got meeting areas, and a 3-story tower that you see there that's housing most of the city's nonprofit offices. And it's got an office for the Sons and Daughters of Douglas Alumni Association. It's a nonprofit 501c3 corporation that does various programs around the Kingsport community in the name and the memory of the people like me who attended Douglas Elementary High School. To top it all off, in just a few short years, the community that once had the highest crime rate in the city of Kingsport celebrate having almost no crime at all. Last year, Kingsport's African American community watched with a rather curious eye the city's 100th birthday celebration last year. The question of where the African American community goes as Kingsport moves into its next century, believe it or not, it's a big topic of discussion in the black community. One thing's for sure, Kingsport's African American population has its roots deep within the soul of the Douglas School building. A turning point was when they dedicated the V.O. Dobbins Center back in 2010. It was a turning point to the violence and the indifferences of the 60s and 70s integration process. At that dedication, the DB Pep Band played the Douglas High School song for the first time. What made this significant is that nobody ever thought they'd be hearing the DB Band play this song. It brought tears to the eyes of many people who attended that dedication. We're getting to this here in a minute, but I do want to say a lot of African Americans in Kingsport are hoping the city doesn't forget them, that they remember that they're there, that they reach out, that they continue reaching out. There's some great culture among the people that I grew up with. Just talk to this man right here. I mean, there's so much of Kingsport that most people don't know about. There's a whole lot of Kingsport's African American community that a whole lot of people don't know about. So how do you get the black community involved? You get them to either stay here when they graduate high school, or you get them to come back here. You give them something to do that gets them to come back. When I moved away to go play TV for 48 years, I couldn't do what I've done over 48 years. I couldn't do that here. I couldn't do that at Channel 5, at Channel 11. I was the main anchor. 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock. I gave the news, an African American. To this day, and it sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm not, because I need to make this point. To this day, I am, and I was up to this point, the only African American male to anchor a main newscast in all of East Tennessee. Still, to this day, we don't have an African American male co-anchoring the news in Tri-Cities, Knoxville, or Chattanooga. Why is that? What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that picture? You've got to get them to come here. You've got to offer them enough money. You've got to say, look, this is a great place to live. We all know it's a great place to live. We know that. We raised our kids here. This is a wonderful place to raise our kids. Are you kidding me? Kingsport? Look at what they're doing. Look at all the construction going on out here. Look at what they're going to do with Brickyard Park when they expand that over there. Look at Cement Hill. I've been to the top of Cement Hill. I've looked off of that lately. They're not supposed to know I did that. But I did. I did, because I had to get pictures. Do you know how far you can see from Cement Hill? You can see all the way to Stone Drive that way. You can see all the way to Mount Carmel this way. You can see all of the mountains, Clinch Mountain, all the way from one end of the horizon to the other. This is a wonderful place to raise kids. We have got to recruit them to come here. We've got to recruit. Sometimes it's not just the African American kids, although I have an emphasis on them. But we've got to get our kids to stay here. There's something about home that, trust me, it brings me back 2 or 3 times a week. I burn that interstate up coming up here. I could drive that interstate with my eyes closed, which, by the way, the Highway Patrol thinks I do that anyway, given the tickets. But you've got to get them to come back here. If you want diversity in your community and your workforce, you've got to go out and you've got to recruit qualified African Americans to come here and stay. And the only way you can do that is to give them something to do in their spare time. My mother used to like to walk the river walk. She would walk the river walk all the time, because it was, not only was it something to do, but it was good exercise. This, by the way, is also what makes a community great. As many of you know, I love bridges. No, let me take that back. I love bridges. For years, I fed a passion that I got right here in Kingsport to photograph bridges just like this one here. This is the Glazes Ford Bridge on the Nolichucky River between Limestone and Telford in Washington County. I told Alex I was going to tell you a little bit about that, and he said, okay, Calvin, just put it down at the end. But go ahead. We'll have you back, but we won't talk about the other stuff first. Check this out. When the county built a new bridge upriver from this one on the Nolichucky River, they didn't know what to do with this one. It cost too much money. They didn't have the money to tear it down, to hire a company to come in and tear it down. So they went to the lady who lives in the house on the hill overlooking this bridge. They asked her if she wanted it. You want that bridge? And she was like, well, after she picked her mouth up off the floor, she said, yeah, why not? Why not? You're going to give it to me? They signed it over to her. The owner owns this bridge. Can you imagine the property tax assessment? House, barn, field, tractor, bridge. Where'd that come from? I know you're going to know this one. For years, it was the only way to get to Johnson City from Kingsport. The Hammond Bridge is as much a part of Kingsport as Broad Street, as J. Fred Johnson's department store, as a Pal's hamburger. Well, yeah, Pal, make that a big Pal double with cheese, with bacon, and a large Frenchy fry, okay? As much a part of Kingsport as Stone Drive's sidewalks. The problem that we've got is Broad Street, Pals, and those sidewalks may be with us forever. This bridge may not be. The Hammond Bridge is on TDOT's list to be torn down and replaced with a new, boring, no character bridge, just like the one that's beside it right now. No character, no elegance, no class, no architectural beauty, no nothing. This is going to happen. They're going to tear this thing down in perhaps months, maybe years, but probably closer to months. It's on the list to be torn down. But it does not have to be that way. We can save this icon. We can save this souvenir of Kingsport's history. I'm proposing saving this bridge to link Kingsport's new city park that they want to build behind the Walmart out here on the Fort Henry Drive. They're going to build a new riverfront park down there. And then they're going to connect that to the Kingsport Riverwalk. Why not save this bridge, turn it into a walking path that connects Kingsport to Colonial Heights? Those people are still mad at us for annexing them. Yeah, they're still mad at us. This is a way to get them into Kingsport and to do it in a way that everybody likes doing now. Everybody likes bicycle paths. They like running, they like jogging paths, they like walking paths. Why not save that bridge and connect it to the new city park across the Holston River? It is so easy to do. It is so easy to do. Kingsport's already done that. Stop and think. Kingsport's already done that. The Netherland End Bridge out here, the Rotherwood, but that crosses into Rotherwood. They spent thousands of dollars building that walkway to cross that bridge that's there, that historic bridge that's been there since 1938. And that connected Rotherwood to the Riverwalk and to the rest of Kingsport. Why can't we do that with the Hammond Bridge? If you see or hear of a petition to save the Hammond Bridge, please sign it. Please sign it. We can preserve this historic gentleman, and we can also get some good exercise out of it too. Both of these bridges are in my coffee table book. I was showing it here a few minutes ago. I bought some with me if you'd like to purchase one. It's $35. It makes a great focal point for anybody's coffee table. I hope I haven't put you to sleep. Thank you for listening. May God bless you. May God bless the people in Riverview I grew up with. And may God bless Kingsport, my hometown. Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. You know, one of the amazing things about this is Bill Ring and Alec Anderson and I grew up here, and an awful lot of that was going on right beside us, and we didn't even know it. I hate we know some, but that's amazing, and it's wonderful to hear it.
Betty Iverson, raise your hand, Betty. I think she told me at church last week, she said, I taught Calvin in the 5th or 6th grade in Bible school
Everything
at Dobbins when they were, and what did you say that you thought about him?
He was an excellent student.
An excellent student. Okay. Well, that's good.
So when you were spanking me when I was a little boy in the neighborhood, see? Other people saw it.
This has been a great program with seeing Jack is state champion. He said they had 15 people on the football team at Douglas and they won the state champion. He said you couldn't get hurt because they didn't have anybody to replace you. Thank you, Bill, for that. That was great.
Nothing else. Thank everybody, and thank you, Calvin, and thank you, Jack.